thank you very much. I'm excited to see everybody here today, that we have kind of a cross-section of UDOT people. But as Garrett said, I'm Patty Smith, and I work for DB Consulting. I retired from UDOT at the end of 2013, and I spent some time working as the Region Utility Coordinator in Region 1. And then I finished my career working on the first Salt Lake section of the Mountain View project. So if you don't know me, that's a little bit of my background. Today we're going to talk about the Utility Manual of Instruction, and primarily the updates and the changes that have happened since the manual was first published. We'll spend a little bit of time going over the kind of information that's in the manual, but we're not going to go through it in detail. We're going to focus in this presentation on what's changed since the manual that's posted now. The manual was originally posted in January of 2013. Prior to that, there was a period of time that there wasn't a statewide utilities engineer. And in 2012, the position was reestablished. Rex Harris was the first statewide engineer at that time. He started the development of a manual of instruction, and Richard Manser finished it. We had some training presentations on the manual and utility coordination that was a little more comprehensive. In 2014, I don't know, Brian mentioned it. It's been a little while ago. I don't know how many of you were here for that training. It was in this very room. But since then, there have been some pretty significant changes and advancements in utility coordination and accommodation. We have a new administrative rule, R930-8, for utility relocations required by highway projects. It's actually been in effect now for more than a year, so some of you have already been familiar with it, but we'll talk about what we've got in the manual for it. In 2016, a new R930-7 was developed, and of course the 2017 standard specifications have some changes and updates that are relative to utility coordination on projects. The purpose of the Manual of Instruction when it was originally written was to establish a step-by-step process for successful utility coordination on projects, and also to provide uniformity between the regions and between projects. As I mentioned, for a period of time there wasn't a statewide position, and more and more consultants were getting involved with doing utility coordination on projects, and we wanted there to be a resource to make sure that we were consistent throughout the state and throughout the projects. That's our afternoon meeting. Today I'd like to go around the room and have everybody introduce yourself and explain your role so I can get an idea of who we have in the audience today. We'll spend a few minutes going over an overview of the entire manual so you know what kind of information is provided in it. We'll talk about roles and responsibilities of the parties responsible for utility planning on projects, and then the state and federal laws and regulations. And then we're going to take a little break, and we have a video about, an FHWA video about utility coordination and utility certification that we'll show after the break. We'll spend some time talking about utility coordination information by project delivery method, and also Garrett's going to take a few minutes and talk about what's on the horizon for the utility program. Okay, the Manual of Instruction is divided into sections. There's an introductory section that goes over some of the attitudes and behaviors that contribute to successful coordination. In this manual, we added an acronyms and abbreviations sections and definitions at the beginning of the manual. It's a little bit more in format like the Railroad Coordination or Manual of Instruction, if you're familiar with it. There's a section on roles and responsibilities, a section on laws, rules, and regulations, including Numerous hyperlinks to source documents if you want to. There's an overview of the laws and the regulations, and then a link to the source documents. A section on utility coordination for design bid build projects. Section 5 is utility coordination on purple and orange book projects. It's been updated to match the 2014 guidelines for those projects. A section on CMGC projects, design build projects. We added a section 8 to this manual for utility coordination requirements on local government projects. There are some pretty unique responsibilities on local government projects, and some things that we need to be aware of on those projects. And then the former section 9 was more geared into just permitting, but with the new accommodation rule, we've expanded that section to have more of an overview of the entire utility accommodation program and administrative rule. If you have any questions along the way or anything, please feel free to speak up. We'll talk through, try and address your, any questions that you may have. Again, the manual includes section 1, has an overview of utility coordination. There's a description in there of the statewide and region-wide utility meetings. You're probably aware that the region coordinator, or region leaders, and the statewide director meet on a quarterly basis to talk about issues and developments. And every other meeting, the one that's roughly in April and in August, they include representatives from the utility companies. And after the STIP workshop, they go over the STIP with all of the utility representatives so that they have a look ahead at UDOT projects. And that's pretty important to them so that they can prepare for their share of whatever the relocation costs might be. There's an overview of the manual of instruction, and then there's it provides links to all of the other project delivery networks that involve utility coordination activities. We're going to talk a little bit more about the design phase project delivery network when we get a little further into the presentation, but the PDN isn't the only UDOT delivery network that includes the utility tasks, as I said. The concept phase, the environmental phase, and then after construction begins, the construction engineering management network, as well as the project closeout network, all contain tasks related to utility planning, design coordination, and all the way up to final project billing closeout. Section 2, roles and responsibilities in the manual, is divided into 3 sections. Central office functions include statewide railroad and utility program management section is at central. The statewide permitting program is at the central level. Utility agreement and billing management is handled in the construction office at central. Also, legal counsel structures, if there are any utility-related impacts or attachments to structures that could be involved. The comptroller's office and internal office, or internal audit. At the region level, project level utility coordination is managed at the region by the region utility leaders. And I do know that still it was the same way when I was doing region utility coordination. The regions are all staffed a little bit differently. The titles are a little different. The responsibility is a little different. But in general, the management functions that take place at the region are these. Project managers are at the project level. The region right-of-way and survey staff. Permitting operations management is by the right-of-way coordinator, control coordinator in each region. There's a region Blue Stakes coordinator, a fiber operations manager, and then of course the resident engineers. A lot of responsibility relative to utility relocation work. Non-UDOT functions are described in the manual. This includes Blue Stakes of Utah, the local governments, cities, counties, and local districts, and also the utility companies themselves. So what's new at Central since the manual was originally posted? The position that was formerly known as the statewide utilities engineer is now the statewide railroad and utilities director. You probably all know that's Elena Spenlow. She's not here with us today. She's out of town. But you in Region 2 know Elena, and you know how good she is at this job. The position that was formerly known as the statewide permits officer is now the outdoor advertising control program manager. That's Rod McDaniels. Statewide permitting operations includes these 4 different functions. Outdoor advertising control is handled at the central level. The other functions, access management, encroachment permits, and special event permits are done at the region level. There is still a position called statewide permits officer, but they're both in the outdoor advertising control realm. And then the position that was formerly the agreements and utilities specialist in the construction office is now the contracts and compliance specialist. That's Amber Routson. And if you've started training with Masterworks for construction contract management, her title in that program is the Central Financial Analyst. We're going to go down there. There haven't been a lot of changes in the federal laws, so we're just going to go down through the laws that there are. There are 3 different U.S. codes that relate to utility matters. 109 is for utility accommodation on federal highways. It gives states guidance on the kinds of factors that need to be considered when they're developing a policy to allow utilities to use and occupy the right-of-way. Section 123 deals with relocation reimbursement. That's the section that says that the states, you can use federal funding for utility relocation costs as long as it doesn't violate any local laws. So in Utah, where we have a combination of reimbursement requirements by state code, the 50% reimbursement situation and the 100% reimbursement, because that's what our law is, then federal funds can be used as long as we're in compliance with our own laws. And then Section 313 are the Buy America, is the Buy America code. In support of the laws are the Code of Federal Regulations relating to utilities. 23 CFR 645 includes Subpart A for relocation, adjustment, and reimbursement. Subpart B is accommodation. And then there's a program guide that supports and explains a little bit in more detail what the Code of Federal Regulations says in the background. And then the Code of Federal Regulations for Buy America. As you're aware, anytime you have a construction project that is subject to Buy America, all of the utility contracts and relocations on that project are also subject to Buy America. Specifically related to utility work, it's important that the utility companies and they are also are aware of Buy America and the requirements, that they know from the very beginning of the planning process that it is a Buy America project. Acquiring Buy America compliant materials typically or frequently take longer to procure and cost more than non-Buy America compliant materials. So that needs to be taken into consideration when you're planning the timeline of your projects. The documentation for Buy American compliance varies between utility companies. It isn't a single certification, a single format. You need to make sure you work with your region utility leaders to make sure that the appropriate expectation for each utility company as far as their compliance with Buy America is. And the Buy America requirements are evolving frequently, and the region utility coordinator is available if you have any questions or need assistance with Buy America requirements on projects during design or construction. So you may be familiar from construction contract application as well. There have been some changes in the Buy America program. In 2012, Federal Highways released a clarification memorandum, it was called, that offered a little bit of relief from the understanding at the time of what was applicable to Buy America. I don't know how many of you were in the infamous sprinkler spring discussion that happened at the AGC office, but for a period of time, yeah, it was interpreted that every single iron or steel component of any kind of product had to meet Buy America and be documented that it did. The 2012 manufactured product gave a little bit of relief in that, in a nutshell, that a device or a material had to be predominantly iron or steel. There were exceptions for some minor components. It was intended to address the fact that the administrative burden for documenting compliance was higher than the return on that. In 2015, the United Steelworkers Union filed suit against the memorandum, more because they felt that it was substantial enough that it should have gone through a rulemaking process and the industry should have had the opportunity to comment on the clarification, and in 2015 a court struck it down. So for the time being, that interpretation is not acceptable. We had gone through and looked at the different utilities and the materials of theirs and tried to give some guidance on the kinds of things that were absolutely subject to Buy America and the kinds of things that met the criteria of the clarification memorandum. I think we've stripped those out of everything. It's out of the manual, it's out of CEMT training, it's out of everything. For now, the minimal use exception is still in place. If it's the amount of the Buy America materials, the cost of them is less than 0.1% of the total contract, or $2,500, whichever is greater. And again, this applies, the construction contract is one contract and the utility agreements each are their own individual contracts. So that's still available. But also consequently, FHWA submitted a proposal for a nationwide waiver from Buy America for what they're calling commercially available off-the-shelf products with steel and iron components. Similar in concept to what the clarification memorandum had tried to address. You know, the administrative burden for minor iron and steel materials didn't meet the larger purpose of the Buy America specs. There's also a permanent waiver that's been requested for proprietary steel tie wire for one process. and some relief from applicability of products that are not produced specifically for projects.
So
Chip?
I have a question on that one. How do we do the waivers? Because we're seeing more and more of these projects, especially with railroad crossings and UTA, where they may have precast rail crossing pieces that they've stockpiled somewhere and they want to use on these projects, but we're telling them they have to be Buy America, meaning they have to go recast these and get steel certs on it, but they've got to stack up in the yard to replace them in kind, basically, when they fail. But we're not, it's almost like they're not being able to use them. So I'm wondering, how do we do the waiver for them to be able to use those elements? Or would that be one of those?
Well, the question is, how do you get a waiver for a product on an individual project? I'm not sure that I can answer that accurately. There is information about it. I do know that this particular request is a nationwide waiver. Just real quickly, let me say that the comment period, it was posted on the Federal Register. The comment period ended in December. I know I'm on the email notification list, so is Elena, I'm sure Richard is too. They still haven't made a decision about whether they're going to grant this waiver. Back to your question, yeah, there is the ability to do project by project waivers, but it has to be just that. It would only be for an individual project. I understand it's a very, very lengthy process, so it would be something that you would have to start, I would say, not only months, but years in advance of a project, if that's reasonable. I know if you're interested in Buy America, you can search for this Buy America COTS, and it'll give you all of the background of how this has evolved. There's a lot of information there if you're specifically interested in it. I think there's also information, Richard, maybe you can help me at some point. There's information online about how to apply for waivers, but and some have been granted. I don't think it's.
Yeah, I was going to add to that, Patty. If it's available, commercially available, and it's not a hardship situation, they're not going to grant a waiver for it. So reinforcing steel is one of those things that's easily obtainable. So I don't think that's ever going to happen.
Okay. Just thought I'd ask because they're wanting to use them as, you say it's a higher cost to go recast an element you've got sitting there.
Right.
Yeah, I agree.
He knows all about it.
No, it's UTA.
It's UTA.
Yeah.
They also know about it.
They do. But they don't respect it.
Well, hopefully this nationwide waiver will be granted because it's an issue. It's an administrative issue. That's for sure. A lot of management involved to meet the highest standard of what they're asking for. Again, a few changes in state laws since the manual was originally published. There are 2 state codes that deal with utility issues. One is the Transportation Code, Regulation of Utilities, Relocation of Utilities. This is the section that specifies, among other things, again, but this is where the state law states that we pay 50% for utility relocations for utilities that are located in the right-of-way, and 100% when the utility company has a property interest in the location that they are, or it's owned by a political subdivision. There was a small change relative to a couple of changes in different laws about public utility easements. For 100% reimbursement, utilities located in public utility easements have been added to the law as 100% reimbursable. There was some ambiguity with that over the years. You'll see all the way through here that there's been trying to address an effort to address some issues that have occurred over and over again, questions that have come up. But utilities in PUEs are subject or are entitled to 100% reimbursement. That's changed. The Public Utilities Code, Title 54, includes the establishment of the Public Service Commission. There was a change to the public utility easement section that on how public utility easements are created. It isn't just by the subdivision process anymore. They can be created in other ways. Section 54.329, the relocation required by highway construction or reconstruction, notice and cooperation. This is the code that was put together, proposed by the utility companies in response to their feeling that they didn't get enough advance notification of construction, highway construction projects, specifically from local governments. The cities and the municipalities weren't informing the utility companies when they were doing their own projects, but it also applies to UDOT. And it established a minimum expectation for utility companies being informed of upcoming projects, being informed if they were eligible for any reimbursement for their costs, being allowed to participate in the design and planning process with a goal of minimizing utility relocations, minimizing future relocations, minimizing outages to their customers and a few other things. So it established an expectation on the part of the utility companies of how they're going to interact with agencies that are doing projects. The Public Service Commission has jurisdiction over utilities in all of their operational aspects. UDOT has jurisdiction over safety features, and that's why we can protect our right-of-way and our highway users from utility installations, because the safety of their facilities is our responsibility. The location, not their operational or their regulatory. And the damage to underground utility facilities is the blue stakes, commonly known as the blue stakes law. Requires all utilities, regardless of who they're owned by, to participate in the one-call system. We talked a little bit about the new administrative rules. If those of you are been around as long as I have, the former rule, it was called the Manual for the Accommodation of Utilities and the Protection of State Highway Rights-of-Way. It was a pretty Frankenstein together document that included utility accommodation, a little bit on utility relocations by highway projects, and then access management was piggybacked onto it, doubled the size of the document. There were a lot of inconsistencies, a lot of contradictions. It had been, you know, as I say, Frankenweenied together a million times, and finally there's clarity, much more user-friendly rules. R930-6 is access management. It has its own rule. R930-7 is utility accommodation, and R930-8, utility relocations required by highway projects. A long time coming. Picks up a lot of, again, the things that have been ongoing issues on projects and provided some clarity. Also, R907-64 is the administrative rule for telecommunication longitudinal placement in interstate rights-of-way. Includes quite a bit of information about that. The conditions and responsibilities. The telecoms that are located under this rule do compensate UDOT for that access, either by way of fees or by providing service to UDOT. And those facilities are required to relocate at their own cost anytime they're directed to do so by the department. So that's different than, it's separate from the state law on relocation reimbursement. We added a little bit of detail because of these new rules. We added a little bit of detail. We're going to go over them in a little bit of depth so you understand what's in them. I'll say up front so I don't forget when I get to the end. It's a good idea to read through them once. And at least then you'll have it in your mind of the kind of information that you can go to the rules for. The accommodation rule is longer. The relocation rule is a little bit shorter. But on the accommodation end, the Code of Federal Regulations requires every state that receives federal funding to issue a statement about their authority and power and the processes and procedures that they use to allow utilities to occupy their rights of way. The purpose of the rule is to maximize public safety, provide for efficient highway operations, maximize aesthetic quality, minimize future conflicts between the utility facilities and the highway systems, and to ensure that the utility use doesn't impair or impede the higher purpose, the transportation purpose of the right-of-way. The rule provides the source documents that gives UDOT the authority to administer the rights-of-way, and also references the AASHTO Accommodation of Utilities Guide, as well as the Roadside Design Guide and the Policy on Geometrics. There's a lengthy section on definitions in the new rule. It supersedes the former rule and also stipulates that if industry or any other regulations have stricter requirements for the utility placements than the rule does, the stricter rule would apply. So if NESC, for example, has a vertical clearance requirement, or if a pipeline industry has a separation or depth of bury requirement that exceeds what our rule requires, the higher standard applies. The rule applies to privately, cooperatively, publicly owned utility companies, including those owned by political subdivisions. It doesn't apply to utilities that are required for highway purposes, UDOT's own systems. Underground, surface, overhead facilities and bridge attachments, and all federal aid highway projects, including local government projects. General installation requirements for all utilities to be in state right-of-way include they must have a statewide utility license agreement with UDOT. Elena's office, the statewide Railroad and Utilities Director's office, manages those statewide license agreements. A company has to have a statewide license agreement before they can apply for an encroachment permit for installations or maintenance work on their facilities. They have to have the SULA, but having a SULA does not guarantee that individual permits will be issued. The companies are required to have a continuous bond or liability insurance, including the political subdivisions, unless they're part of the municipal insurance pool. There are provisions for emergency work if they have to access the right-of-way and notifying UDOT. A requirement that they participate in the one-call program, and also restrictions on cutting new pavements. General design requirements. Utility installations are required to meet the AASHTO design guides and policies. The utility companies have to maintain and have comprehensive plans, drawing, and specifications for their facilities and their installation. They need to reference the highway system, the route, milepost, and centerline references. They have to show existing and proposed facilities, provide traffic control plans, comply with their own industry standards and codes, and UDOT may require subsurface utility installation to be, or subsurface utility engineering to be performed by utility companies if it's warranted in an individual situation. The definitive design requirements, that's where you find things like depth of bury requirements, vertical clearance, clear zone, compliance with ADA requirements for utility installations. This section also requires utilities, cable companies that want to attach to another company's poles has to demonstrate approval from the owner of the poles before they can get an encroachment permit to place those facilities. This section also includes installation methods, plowing, open trenches, trenchless shoring requirements, bore pits, casings, crossings, median installations, where and when utility appurtenances can be in the right-of-way, manholes, vents, drains, boxes, pedestals. There are requirements, environmental compliance for utility installations, and historic and archaeological requirements for installations. So when you're planning a project, when you're designing a project and you're coordinating with utility companies, all of these definitive design requirements of the accommodation rule need to be applied to the planning that you're doing with utility companies. The 2017 specifications, this is now a standard drawing. It was a supplemental drawing prior to that. This just shows those vertical clearance, depth of bury, clear zone requirements in just kind of a visual way for your use when you're doing utility coordination and planning where your utilities are going to go on highway relocations. The definitive design instructions also include the requirements for utilities on highway structures. If you have a situation where you have an existing one, a proposed one, you're considering one, the Structures Division needs to be involved with evaluating those for load and vertical clearance. Pipelines need to have shutoffs on both sides of the structure. Communication and electrical facilities have to be grounded. They have to account for expansion and contraction of the structure. And there must be no viable cost-effective alternative. You know, it's a subjective consideration, but it's something that needs to be put towards considering structure attachments. The Structures Division prefers to evaluate any time a major, utility is being installed within 50 feet of a structure, the foundation of a structure. It's a good idea to check in with them and make sure that they're aware of it. There's a section in the rule also that complements the other administrative rule about interstate access controlled right-of-way access for utilities, and that's crossings as well. A section on utility construction and inspection, maintenance responsibility, deviations from the rule, and enforcement of the rule. We can talk a little bit about deviations. There are sometimes situations, like comparing it to a design exception, for example. If you have a situation, a utility does or a project does, where a minor deviation from the strict standard of the administrative rule, as long as it doesn't violate state or federal regulations, it's for the public good, and it doesn't compromise the highway in any way, then deviations can be used and documented to allow utilities to have minor adjustments for a larger purpose. Those with limited impact are considered on an individual basis. They can be granted at the region level. And cost is not a deciding factor. It's something that should be done for a more substantial reason than just it would cost the utility company more to place it at the correct depth than not to. If it's a significant impact, the requirement, it needs to be a formal request from the utility company. It's evaluated from more perspectives: design, safety, environmental, and economic impacts. The region permits officer or supervisor has to recommend allowing the deviation, and the region director needs to recommend allowing the deviation. It needs to be concurred to by the statewide utilities director and also by FHWA if it's a federal aid highway. This is only the top part of the form, but a form has been developed for project teams or utilities to use if they do want to have a deviation from a rule considered by UDOT. This is going to become important as time goes on. We have some remedies that can be taken against utility companies, and out of compliance placement is one of the things that that can be considered in the future. If a deviation is granted on a future project, if a utility is found to be out of compliance with the administrative rule, then they'll want to be able to demonstrate that they were granted that deviation at the time of the placement. Okay, the new administrative rule R930-8 for utility relocations required by highway projects. Again, it's been a long time coming. This is a really useful tool and provides some pretty distinct guidance to projects when they're relocating utilities. It sets forth the department's requirements and authority as to how the utility companies coordinate and cooperate when relocations are required as part of highway projects. And it also sets forth options that the department may pursue with utility companies when a utility fails to cooperate or comply as required by state law or statute. The authority is given pursuant to Utah Code. There's a list of definitions. Excuse me. I've had a cold and I'm trying to stay ahead of that. Included in the definitions is a definition for non-operating property. There's some clarification about when utility relocations and impact should be handled as utility relocations or whether they should be handled as right-of-way acquisitions under the Uniform Act. In terms of utility company coordination and cooperation, UDOT and utility companies will use their best efforts to identify conflicts, minimize relocation costs and operational impacts, as well as highway costs and delays. UDOT is required to offer a scoping meeting to the utility companies and provide authorization for design engineering work. I think we pretty much do that already. So that's what our minimum requirements are. The utility company is required to provide locations, identify conflicts, and provide their right-of-way documents as early as practicable. Submit designs, cost estimates, reasonable schedules for their work, and any required outage windows that they need or operational impacts to their facilities. Execute a written agreement with the department. Utility companies are required to coordinate with the contractor to develop a detailed work plan and schedule and submit a written acknowledgement of the approved schedule to the department and perform work in accordance with the approved plan. So I underlined reasonable schedules. The rule requires a reasonable schedule from a utility company to include the work sequencing, the task durations, material ordering and procurement, notification requirements to the utility companies and the contractors, mobilization, third-party coordination, communication between the parties, and any other activities that are necessary for the relocation. That may be clearing and grubbing needs to be done, or the right-of-way needs to be acquired, or whatever other requirements there are. And I think this is a little bit more detailed than we've typically asked utility companies to provide. But there's a purpose to that. Also requiring the contractor and the utility companies to develop and agree to a plan of how the work is going to be done. That's going to become significant as well when we go on through the rest of the provisions of the new rule. Timeliness. The utility is to timely complete the work so as not to delay or increase the cost to the highway project. The department is responsible to provide reasonable deadlines for the work so that the highway project won't be delayed. We need to have reasonable expectations about what they're going to be able to do, and the department is responsible to provide updates, reasonable updates of the project schedule. And that's at the design phase as well as the construction project. If you're going to accelerate a project in the design phase, if you're going to postpone or delay or cancel a project at the design phase, the utility needs to know. And the terms timely and reasonable are pretty subjective, and that's necessary because the complexity and the scope of the utility relocations is going to vary from project to project. But I think the intent of what the rule is trying to do is there. The communication needs to be practical, the expectations need to be reasonable, and then the commitments need to be fulfilled in a timely manner. Again, just real quickly, this rule applies to the department and to the utility companies. It doesn't apply to the consultants that work for UDOT or the contractors who work for UDOT. UDOT is responsible for the actions of our agents and our contractors in terms of fulfilling their obligations under their contracts or the standard specifications. So we'll get to that a little bit more as we go on. The relocation section of the rule incorporates 23 CFR 645 by reference. No more ambiguity about whether it only applies to federal funded projects and not to state funded projects. It's the guidelines that we follow on all projects. Real property needs relative to utility property will be determined according to the administrative or the accommodation rule, whether it's a utility relocation or a right-of-way acquisition. It requires utility companies to jointly occupy trenches if their regulatory and construction requirements can be met. So, yeah, occasionally you'll have a utility company that doesn't want to participate in a joint trench opportunity. Now they're required to do it unless they have an operational reason not to. The department can compel them to do that. Also requires utilities to cooperate for joint use of above above ground facilities, their installation and relocation. And if facilities don't need to be replaced at all, their acquisition will be handled as a right-of-way. A right-of-way acquisition.
Patty, is that going to be conflictive if they have their own space under a project currently and you say going forward we're going to relocate you together?
I wish Elena was here to answer some of those kinds of questions. I don't. Do you have a feeling yet? Garrett's still in the drinking from a fire hose phase, I think. So I don't know. We can. I would. Their own space in terms of if they have separation requirements by their industry and a few other things like that, I think we're probably obligated to allow them that same. I don't think we can ask them to have any less than what they currently have, but I don't.
So the key word is functionally replaced. So they do not have a right to the same space or same areas, have the right to function and operate as they previously did.
I didn't repeat that one. Sorry. Okay. I must have moved up there. Replacement of property rights. If facilities are currently in a public utility easement, the department can provide a replacement public utility easement and require the utilities to relocate into it. If there are any betterments in their between their existing property interest and the property interest acquired for them, they're required to pay the difference in value between those. Utilities can relocate onto replacement property when the department has a court-ordered occupancy or right of entry. We had some issues with that, I know, on the Mountain View project where it's a greenfield project, we were purchasing only right-of-way. And the utility companies had some issues with moving on to a patchwork. Some was fully acquired, some was in condemnation. They wanted to make sure that they were protected to go ahead and go through all of them. And now, as long as we have court-ordered right of entry, and the condemnation process is proceeding, then the utility companies can go ahead and relocate onto that property. And that the acquisition of any non-operating real property would be in accordance with the Uniform Act and not a utility relocation.
Patty, on that previous one about relocating onto court-ordered properties or we have a RU, does that apply even if, for example, we have a property that we've done a total take, we've acquired that property, but surrounding that, we're going to eventually be dedicating a PUE for them to be relocated into? Would that apply to those situations where they're required to relocate even though the PUE has not necessarily been dedicated? Maybe Richard can help on that.
I hate to give you my opinion.
Yeah.
I would work with the right-of-way department. I think you could definitely require them to relocate, but there may be some issues with the PUE they want to get ironed out in the agreement.
I feel the same way. I feel like there are things, I may have an opinion, but I knew I would miss Elena for more than that reason today, but yeah. Reimbursement of relocation costs, the rule provides, and this is where these deviation documentations are going to come in. If a utility company cannot provide a copy of a permit or the deviation form going forward, showing that a department has accepted a deviation with respect to overhead clearance requirements, the utility is required to relocate without reimbursement. That basically means if they're not in compliance now, it's their responsibility to put themselves in compliance with the vertical clearance requirements, and not the projects. Utility billings, final billings are to be submitted within 6 months of the completion of utility relocation work unless agreed to in advance by the parties. Costs incurred with compliance for state and federal requirements is included in relocation costs. Temporary utility facility relocations are to be included in the relocation costs as well. That's new in this rule. And again, telecom companies and interstate right-of-way are required to pay all of their relocation costs when they're ordered by the department in accordance with R907-64. Betterment credits, again, this is from the Code of Federal Regulations. It's repeated in the rule. No betterment credit is required for replacement facilities or devices that are required by the highway project of equivalent standards, although not identical, of the next highest grade when the existing grade is no longer manufactured, required pursuant to any governmental or regulatory code, or required by the current design practices followed by the utility in its own work. So they're eligible for reimbursement for the costs to come out, to be at their current standards. Okay, the summary of responsibility again, before we move on to the remedies. The utility company is required to provide a reasonable relocation schedule. Again, you're not necessarily going to have things like start dates and end dates, but you will have durations and requirements and communications. Where does the project need to be, or the progress of the project need to be before the utility relocations can occur? The purpose of that, the intent is for the information that the utilities provide to be included in the contract documents for all of the proposers to be aware of, in a certain amount of detail, more than maybe we have historically in the past, as a special provision to the limitation of operation standard specification typically, or the control of work specification. The utility companies are required to coordinate with the department's contractor to develop a detailed work plan, schedule, and identify matters of mutual concern, and submit written acknowledgement to the department, to the resident engineer, that they are aware of each other's schedule and they're in agreement. The utilities will perform in accordance with the plan, and the department is responsible to make sure that they're given reasonable deadlines for the work and any updates to the project schedule. And again, this applies either to the design or the construction phase of the project. The administrative rule allows the department to issue administrative orders against utility companies that fail to timely cooperate or coordinate during the design or construction phase of a project, including a reasonable time frame to complete the relocation. If a utility fails to comply and failure is not due to a third party that's beyond the utility's control, the department may issue an order to remedy noncompliance, including recovering increased costs caused by unreasonable or unjustified delays, deny further encroachment permits to the company, or perform design and construction work on behalf of the utility if it's not something, a regulatory situation, transmission, power lines, high pressure gas lines, and a few other things, we wouldn't be able to perform that kind of construction. But within reason, perform work on behalf of the utility and pursue other remedies and claims in district court if the situation warrants it. If a situation is encountered where the pursuit of an administrative order against a utility, this is kind of the process. All administrative orders are issued by the statewide railroad and utility director. The first order can be issued at the request of the region utility leader. It's a legal notice to the company that action may be taken by the department, and importantly, it includes a reasonable time frame to remedy the non-compliance. So whether a situation is occurring during the design phase, if you can't get your executed agreements back when they were requested, if there was a deadline set, or if plans, right-of-way documents, anything aren't being submitted in a timely manner, you can put the utility on notice and provide a time frame for them to become compliant. Second order is issued after a utility fails to comply with the first order. It's legal notice that the department will take action against the utility company, and the statewide utility director confers with region management before an action an order reaches that level. The region leader responsible for the project in that region is responsible to determine that it wasn't anything that was caused by a third party, that the utility company couldn't meet their obligations. So there is an escalation process for the issuance of an administrative order. If it's happening during the design phase or during the construction phase, in that case the resident engineer, notify the region utility leader after conferring with the utility company, of course, that there's an issue. It needs to go through, be escalated through the region utility leader, and they should be allowed an opportunity to correct the situation with the utility company. If that doesn't work, the utility leader escalates it to the statewide utilities director. The utility director also confers with the utility company and decides whether an order is appropriate. If there's a second order, if it reaches that point, the utility director will confer with the region leadership and inform them of the situation, and then it will go from there. If an administrative order is issued against a utility company, they are allowed to request an agency review by the department pursuant to the Administrative Procedures Act. The presiding officer will be the department's director of operations, so it shifts over to out of project development if there's going to be a review of the appropriateness of the administrative order and the pursuit of any of the remedies against the utility company. And the administrative proceedings for the review are informal. And we're going to get into this a little bit more as we get a little further too. Again, the rule is speaking to the department and the utility companies directly, not to the consultants and the contractors that work for UDOT. So it becomes pretty necessary. There's a process that contractors have to follow with respect to the old specs and the 2017 specifications. If there's a potential excusable delay that's taking place on a project, in addition to the requirements of coordinating with third parties during the baseline schedule and the baseline schedule update meetings, there are requirements for contractors when they anticipate a potential delay to notify the resident engineers to start accumulating cost records on the costs. So the department's going to be in a position where they're going to have to evaluate an excusable and compensable delay from the contract standpoint and separately from pursuing any remedy or cost reimbursement by the utility companies for those. So it's kind of two different processes we're going to talk about a little bit more when we get into the project discussion. Any questions about the new administrative rule? Some good stuff in there. Outlines some rights, but also some responsibilities on the part of both the parties. Hopefully the intent of raising the bar and the expectations for the quality of the communication and coordination between the department and the utility companies and the contractors will remedy some of the situations in terms of delays that are experienced before it ever gets to the point that an actual administrative order would have to be actually issued. We had a comment in one of these get-togethers now. This rule's been in effect for almost 2 years, and they think they've already seen some improvement in the performance and the expectations of the parties in terms of making sure that schedule agreement has been reached and documented at least during the construction phase. So we're a little bit before break time.